Okay. All right. Professor Carl Zipper. He is Professor Emeritus of Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech. He served as a faculty member in crop and soil environmental sciences and in plant and environment sciences from 1986 to 2019 when he retired, just in time for COVID. Way to go, Carl. From 1996 to 2019, he served as the director of the Powell River Project, which is a Virginia Tech program that sponsors research and education concerning coal mining and environmental effects and restoration. He conducts research on environmental issues resulting from Appalachian coal mining, including water quality and forest restoration. So take it away, Carl.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Barb. Thank you for the nice introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I recognize a few names and faces. Hello again. It's very great to see you. For those who I don't know, it's nice to meet you. So let me share my screen here, and let me see. I always have to figure out the Zoom thing. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Oh, I didn't share it. That's why. Let me click the share button. Click the share button. Where's the share button? Where's my Zoom? There we go. Where's my Zoom? Zoom meeting. No. I'm sorry. Here we go. Sorry about this. I'm just not very good at all that. Here we go. There's where I need to hit. Okay, I need to hit the share screen. There we go. Share. How's that?
That's it.
Yes.
Okay, what's this other meeting doing in the way here? Okay, here we go. Let me get this. Okay. I imagine you're seeing some things other than my PowerPoint. Is that correct?
No, it looks good now.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So it's a pleasure to speak with you. I'll be speaking about coal mining impacts to forest and stream ecosystems. Much of my research has been collaborative. As Barb mentioned, I worked with Powell River Project, did a lot of collaboration through there. Also worked with the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative, which is a regional group of scientists dealing with forest restoration issues on Appalachian coal mines, and also have some collaborations with the Virginia Water Resources Research Center, which I believe is how you all found me. So it's a pleasure to speak with you. And my presentation goal is to describe impacts of Appalachian mining on forest and streams and ongoing restoration efforts. Our organization will be first, I'm going to just introduce Appalachian coal mining and the type of disturbance it creates. Then we're going to talk about forests, and then we're going to talk about streams. And as many of, or probably all of you are well aware, we live in a marvelously diverse ecosystem here in the Appalachian Mountains, and it's the same out in the coal fields. I like to say that the Appalachian forest is among the most biodiverse, non-tropical ecosystems on planet Earth, and I don't see that as an exaggeration. So the mining has been taking place within this type of ecosystem and creating some pretty severe disturbances. Here, just to see active mining here just some photographs of mining, just talk about how it works. Let's look at the close-up photo on the left. And in the foreground, you see a drill drilling into the rock, drilling holes into the rock, maybe 6-8 inches diameter, 20, 30, 50 feet deep. They'll fill those holes with explosives, blast open the rock. Below the drill, you see the loader material, placing it in the trucks, and the trucks are hauling it away. You see the truck with its back to us, and then you look up on the high wall, just to the left of the truck, you can see a black streak of coal and those rocks there. And that's what they're trying to get at. They're trying to move those rocks so they can get out the coal. On the right, you see an Appalachian surface mine, more of a wide, broad scale view. And you can see they're fairly extensive. There's a lot of activity going on, and this is the way the mining operates. And again, as you can see, it's a fairly significant environmental disturbance, I guess we could say. Here we see a photograph of the mined landscape as it's being reconstructed. And you can see it's basically loose rock and rock fragments that are just being placed back into the mined areas. And clearly the water interacts with these materials. The water quality effects come from the interaction of the water with the rocks. And since that formerly intact rock has been fractured, there are many locations where the water can interact chemically with those freshly fractured rocks. And the chemical reactions that occur release geologic origin elements. We call them geologic origin water contaminants, basically. And I'll speak more about exactly what is released when we get into that section of the presentation. But you can see clearly how the water would interact with this rock material. And part of the mining process is called reclamation, right? When the mining is finished, they reclaim the land, and the goal of reclamation is to prepare the land for a post-mining land use. Primary activities are soil reconstruction and revegetation. On the far left, you can see them grading the mine soil on the new landscape. The rock material, they may revegetate the rock material directly, or they may cover the rock material either with a salvage soil or what they call a topsoil substitute, which would be a form of rock which is pretty well adapted to supporting revegetation. And then they'll grade that material. They'll spray hydroseed on the material just to revegetate it, to control erosion. You can see that in the center. And then in that material, you'll see that what they're hydroseeding is rock. That is certainly not reclaimed, salvage soil. And then in some cases, they plant shrubs and trees. Many of the mine sites historically have been reclaimed nominally for a hayland pasture, post-mining land use, so though many of them never saw cows. In today's world, most of the reclamation is either for what they call unmanaged forest or for wildlife, both of which entail planting of trees or trees and shrubs or whatever. And you see the planting crew on that mine site right there. So that's how the reclamation occurs. There's much concern with valley fills. We hear a lot about valley fills, and we'll just look at the valley fills here. On the left, you see a valley fill under construction, and where the valley fills come from is the valley fills are constructed because of the fact that the rock swells. When the rock is disturbed and broken into fragments, it takes up a larger volume than the original intact geologic structure did. So you have what they call excess spoil material. And that excess spoil material was often disposed of in valley fills. And you see a valley fill under construction right here, where they're basically dumping that material into a valley, just stream channel below the mining operation. And to give you an idea of the scale of what you're looking at, if you look to the left of that valley fill in the left-hand photo, see that little black puddle there, which is basically a coal. The coal that's being excavated, and those small orange dots are very large pieces of machinery. Front end loaders, coal loaders, which are way larger than a typical loader you would see on a residential construction site, for example. So that's a pretty large operation they've got going there. On the right, you see the reconstructed landscape with the revegetation and with the valley fill. And what typically happens is the water infiltrates that landscape, gets into that, gets into the underlying rock, flows downward, and then the lowest point is the toe of the valley fill. So that's where the water comes out. And the valley fills have a fairly significant effect on water quality of streams that drain out of them. So the mining occurs, as we say, on a fairly significant scale. Here we see a photograph or a Landsat image on the upper part of a very large surface mine in southern West Virginia called the Hobet Mine. And then below that, you see a Landsat image of Washington, D.C., the Washington, D.C. metro area with the Potomac River and some of the bridges leading to Northern Virginia. And these two photographs are on the same scale. So this gives you an idea of how large some of these mines can get. Just another aspect of that, this is a results of a study conducted by a nonprofit organization called SkyTruth, where they used Landsat photographs to identify coal surface mines throughout this central Appalachian region, using Landsat images from 85, 90, 95, 2000, et cetera, as you can see on the far left-hand side of the slide. And again, you see the county boundaries, you see the state boundaries, and again, just re-emphasizing that what we're looking at here is especially collectively, the individual mines are large, but then if we look at them collectively, it's I guess, understatement to say it's a significant disturbance, significant environmental disturbance. So let's transition to topic 2, which is impacts on forest. And clearly the mining process itself impacts the forest. You saw those photographs, those mine sites were forested prior to mining, and after mining, no forest, right? Of course, based on the nature of the mining process. But what happens after reclamation and after those mine sites revegetated? Do you see any forest then? So we conducted a study on that in 2005. We conducted research to characterize what characterized the vegetation and soils on post-smacker mine sites in the Appalachian coal fields. And the way we did it was we went to the permitting agencies, the mine permitting agencies in 4 states, and we got their database of mines that had been, areas that had been mined and reclaimed starting 5 years prior to our study. And we selected a random sample from those coal surface mines as a means of trying to characterize the full nature of the disturbance and the recovery process. And these are the mine sites that we sampled along with the reclamation year. In summer, I say we, I wasn't out there, I guarantee, but some folks who worked with us assessed soils and revegetation on these 25 sites. The goal was to get 10 sampling points on each site. Sometimes things didn't work out quite perfectly, but they got 225 points total. The mine sites ranged from 6 to 25 years in age. All had satisfied the mine reclamation obligations and had been released from their permitting obligations, having satisfied everything, all legal requirements. A wide variety of legacy mines conditions were found. We call these legacy mines because they were been mined previously. So they're the legacy of the prior mining. And a wide variety of conditions were found. You see all the way from this prairie-like savanna in southern Ohio, several areas, upper right and lower left, where it's kind of shrub, I guess you would call it. And then the lower right is somewhat foresty, where they had planted some trees on this particular mine site. But you'll see that the species are eastern white pine and red maple. Now these are native species for sure, but does not resemble a native Appalachian forest. And I think that's clearly the message when the researchers assessed the dominant vegetation within a 220-meter radius of each of these sampling points. The vegetation sites, vegetation types are listed on the right-hand side of the slide. And we can see that more than 50% of the dominant vegetation ground cover was exotic invasives, right? And this was no surprise to me as a person who's spent a lot of time on these mines. There's just a lot of invasive plants out there. And part of the reason is that, especially in the old days, they utilized the invasives the exotics as a means of restoring vegetation on these highly altered mine sites. And some of the species that do very well under these conditions are exotics. So of course, when you get a large population of exotics in a particular area, in this case being the mining areas of the Appalachian coal fields, they spread. So even though the exotics were no longer being planted by 2005. Clearly, there's a lot of exotics out there. We conducted another study in 2016. With a graduate student and a collaborator, we utilized Landsat imagery to try to detect the presence of autumn olive. And I know many of you are aware of autumn olive as a species. You're aware that during certain seasons, it has a color, a hue that makes it very visible. It's very distinct from the other vegetation. And that's what made it detectable with Landsat. And you can see the results of this study in the left-hand side here. We assessed, all of the mined areas in the Virginia coal field, all of the areas that have been mined in the Virginia coal field under the federal law up through 2011. 303 kilometers square total area, more than 100 square miles. And in that area, about 13% of the area had enough autumn olive that we could detect it. And with the Landsat image, and those Landsat images are 30 meters by 30 meters by 30 meters. So if you just had one or two autumn olives and a 30 meter by 30 meter pixels, you're not going to, Landsat's not going to see it. So 13% of the of all the mines, reclaimed mines in the Virginia coal field had enough autumn olive that it was detectable by Landsat satellite. So again, in terms of impacts on forest, I think that tells you that the mining is having a pretty severe impact on the Appalachian forest, certainly on the mine sites themselves. So what about recovery? Researchers and I, including Dr. Berger, developed a reclamation method, what we call the forestry reclamation approach, which is a means of reestablishing forest trees on the mine site. This was done in collaboration with the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative. Just to go over it briefly, those of you, I think sure most folks in your group are aware of general plant and soil science principles. Just applying those principles, we're able to create better conditions for reforestation. Basically select a soil material that's going to be suitable for trees, grade it loosely, don't compact it, which was a common method of reclaiming the land. They would compact the soil, trying to prevent erosion. Well, as soil scientists, we know that by uncompacted land is actually, in some cases, less erosive because the water can soak in instead of running off. So, and that's also better for the trees. So grade the soil loosely, seed a tree compatible ground cover, keep away from the fescue, keep away from the orchard grass. We'd like to go with perennial ryegrass, annual ryegrass, birds foot trefoil, less competitive species such as this. Select native tree species that are suited to site conditions. You're going to plant different species on the lower slopes with an eastern aspect than on the upper slopes of a western aspect, for example, and then use proper planting methods. And experimentally, these techniques work very well. They're being widely utilized now by the coal industry, but we haven't had the chance to run an assessment to see how effective they are in aggregate. And one of the main problems, based on anecdotally, is the soil material. The most expensive part of this is getting the soil right. And of course, if you don't get the soil right, the trees don't grow right. And anecdotally, it appears that many of the companies are having difficulty getting this step right, but this is where we are. Another question concerns the legacy mines. What about all these other surface mines that had been mined and reclaimed using non-forest vegetation, such as this one in the photograph, which is probably 10, 15 years old at the time this photograph was taken. And you see some bushes out there, but you don't see many trees, and you don't see it in use for grazing cattle or for raising hay. So how do we reforest these mine sites? And these mine sites actually create a much more difficult challenge because the existing soils and vegetation are in place. We're unable to manipulate the soil, and manipulation of the vegetation is much more expensive because it's because of what is there. The vegetation is very vigorous, very well adapted to those conditions, So in order to reestablish a forest on this type of site, you have to displace that vegetation. So we also developed a method for that. We call it the 4 Ps, right? Plan, prepare, plant, and protect. So we can go through that also very briefly. And again, we did that through Powell River Project initially, and then circulated the information through the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative, which gets it to the agencies and landowners, mining industry, et cetera. But basically, first step is the plan. This means you go on the site and you make a plan. And now here's a legacy mine site, which is a very different condition than the one we looked at previously. The means of getting rid of this pre-existing vegetation, you have to use a different method, and that's all part of the planning. Also, we have different site conditions, which would influence the planning for the operation. Then prepare, and we need to prepare the site for the tree planting. We need to control the existing vegetation is one of the 2 main things that need to be done. We typically do that with herbicides. The vegetation often is removed with a material, with a blade such like this, especially if you've got a bunch of woody vegetation on there. Also need to prepare the soil. As I mentioned, the soils are compacted quite frequently, in some cases because of the mining industry, but also just what we call auto compaction, and that these when you build the soil out of rock with no organic material, no roots and everything of that nature, the material settles over time, which causes it to become more dense and poorly suited for trees. So we like to rip the soil. See that ripping tooth? That ripping tooth would be dragged through the soil to loosen it so we could plant some trees in there. And here we see the result of that. We've alleviated the soil compaction. The soil has been ripped. We also need to apply some nutrients, and the nutrients need to be applied strategically. If you just broadcast nitrogen and phosphorus all over this site, that's going to help the competing vegetation as well as the planted trees. So we like to drop the fertilizer in those rips and then plant the trees in the rips, and that's what we recommend. Then we need to plant, and many of these projects, they're no longer under any industry obligations. So many of these types of projects are done by community organizations and things of this nature. Here we see some volunteers planting trees on this legacy mine site after it has been prepared and ripped. And then we need to protect, right? The soil ripping and fertilization can stimulate the competing vegetation as well as aiding the planting trees. So here you see reforestation site. You see that little, what looks like a white oak in that photograph. And you see the Sericea lespedeza surrounding it. That white oak has been protected by herbiciding a little ring around it, spot spraying a little ring around it. That's why that area right around the tree is free of competing vegetation. And just based on the looks of that Sericea lespedeza behind the gentleman, if it wasn't for that protection, that tree would be a goner. So, so that's it. That's the 4 Ps. That's how these sites are reforested. Here, this method, when properly executed, works. Here are 2 mine sites over in Kentucky that were reforested using these techniques. Green Forest Work is a nonprofit organization run by a University of Kentucky professor, Chris Barton, that does this work. They've treated over 5,000 acres using this technique, which is just a tremendous accomplishment in my view. But unfortunately, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to the 2.5 million acres that have been mined in the Appalachian coal field, most of which are unused and covered with invasive plants. And just one last thing on this technique here, you see that autumn olive in the photograph there, and we're not restoring absolutely pure and clean native forests. Once those invasives get on there, it's really tough to get rid of them. In most cases, it doesn't happen, but still, it's definitely an improvement over the condition that was present prior to the forest restoration activity. Okay, so now let's shift to water just very briefly, because I know we're getting down on our time here. And right? The environmental water interacts with the fractured rock to mobilize geologic origin contaminants, as we already said. The aquatic communities in mining influence stream are usually, and then I say in parentheses, always altered relative to reference streams. And the only reason I don't say always is because we haven't looked at every stream. Anytime we see a stream which is significantly impacted by the mining, the aquatic communities are altered. Most of this work is done by contrasting what happens in the mining influence stream to what we call a reference stream. A reference stream would be draining a relatively undisturbed watershed. And part of the reason for using reference streams is because of the Clean Water Act. When we talk about protecting and maintaining the biological integrity, well, the integrity means relatively undisturbed conditions. So we often compare the mining influence streams to the reference streams in our research, as do many others who work in this area. One of the major pollutants, geologic origin pollutants, are major ions, right? Salinity, as we call it, major ions. Cations, calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium, anion, sulfate, bicarbonate, and chloride. And we measure this typically through total dissolved solids. I know that many of you are familiar with the term total dissolved solids, which refers to the sum total of the dissolved constituents in a water body. And then the total dissolved solids is measured by conductivity, right? And then electrical conductivity is just an easier way of measuring it. And the electrical conductivity corresponds very closely with the total dissolved solids. So as we go through this, we'll be talking about conductivity as an indicator of the salinity and the major ion concentrations in these waters. And as I mentioned, the aquatic communities are often altered, and the aquatic communities most often measured are the benthic macroinvertebrates, right? Because they're definitely environmental indicators. They're easy to sample. They're ubiquitous. And we see this graphic where we see specific conductance or conductivity on the horizontal axis, and we see mayfly richness being the number of species, number of taxa present on the vertical axis. And you can see clearly that as the conductivity increases, the number of species decreases. And that's what we mean by saying that the aquatic communities are altered. So the research here, the reference streams in this site, on this graphic, were up to 140 microsiemens per centimeter, whereas the 19 mining influence streams range from 200 to 1600 microsiemens per centimeter. And the question being asked for this particular project, what is the critical conductivity, the minimum level of salinity associated with the change in community structure? So that we define this dotted line here as the macroinvertebrate community reference condition, which is the lowest mayfly richness in the reference stream, the lowest level of mayfly richness observed in the reference streams. That dotted line is a regression line run through the data cloud. So in order to get the critical conductivity level, we just determine the level associated with that reference condition. It's 284 microsiemens per centimeter. Here's another graphic with another indicator, total richness, total number of species present. It's not quite as clean as the mayfly richness. Mayflies are very sensitive, but you definitely see the same pattern. Here the conductivity, critical conductivity is 276. And these results correspond with an EPA study that found a critical conductivity about 300, saying that in order to protect the native community, good to maintain that conductivity at about 300 microsiemens per centimeter or lower. It's kind of a question as to why the elevated major ions have this effect. I mean, as a soil scientist, I always thought, calcium, magnesium, sodium bicarbonate, these are good things, right? They're plant nutrients, they're macronutrients. So how could slightly elevated concentrations of these elements being having such effect? And I say slightly elevated because water with conductivity of 300 microsiemens per centimeter, that's lower than what many of us drink here in the New River Valley. So it really is quite a question. And it appears that the problem concerns, the aquatic organisms in these waters with the elevated salinity. They need to maintain their internal chemistry. And of course, their outer surfaces, their skin and their, basically the outer surfaces of their body are porous. So water and ions are diffusing through their outer surface. And if they're unable to maintain favorable internal chemistry, they're going to suffer. Either they're going to die or they're going to be required to allow into regulating that ionic transfer, and that's going to impair their other functions. And this is the best explanation, the one explanation for why this occurs, but it clearly is, but it clearly does occur. The altered community structure. Numerous studies have been done of this, and every one of them has come up with similar findings. As mining origin conductivity increases, community structure is altered from the reference condition. These elevated conductivities occur fairly widely across the Appalachian coalfield. This was a map prepared by a former graduate student here at Virginia Tech, Elise Clark, using water monitoring data from the 6 of the 7 Appalachian states. These are distribution of specific inductance values in streams draining watersheds less than 25 miles squared in the Appalachian coalfield, basically interpolated individual observations, interpolated, and you can see that there's a lot of water in the Appalachian coalfield that's above that 300 microsiemens per centimeter critical level, and it's clearly mining influence for the most part, because when we run sulfate using the same technique, you get a very similar pattern, and sulfate is the signature of the mining, the elevated from salinity from the mining influence. Other studies have found that fish, crayfish, mussels, algae, and salamanders also respond negatively to the elevated mining, I guess you would say, to the mining influence as indicated by the elevated conductivity, although again, not necessarily having investigated the mechanism. But in terms of the mechanism, one of the issues is that there are other elements associated with the conductivity, including trace elements, the most prominent one being selenium. And selenium is a trace element, an essential nutrient for mammals. It's highly mobile in aquatic systems. It's released from coal mining rocks at elevated concentrations. And in the mining influence systems, when it bioaccumulates, you see the curvature in the spine of this fish here. And again, that's the signature of elevated selenium from, well, not only from mining influence, but there are other pollution problems associated with elevated selenium. But again, mining is what we're concerned with, here. Basically, let's see here. Okay, and basically the way it works, the selenium bioaccumulation, here we see a stream, let's say mining influenced water is in the stream, the dissolved selenium enters the stream, and then you see the vertical axis here is the selenium concentration in the environmental medium. The selenium concentration in the water is actually very low, in the low parts per billion, higher than what would occur in a non-mined watershed, but still very low. So let's say 5 parts per billion might be a typical level. And uptake by algae and microbes, and when the algae and microbes uptake it, they magnify it, often by as much as 1,000-fold, if not higher, the concentration. So now our concentration in the algae and microbes is in the low parts per million. And then when the algae and microbes are consumed by the consumers, you get trophic transfer, and the selenium concentration increases still further. And again, this is a major problem in the mining influenced watersheds. Elevated mining origin selenium often leads to elevated selenium in consumer organisms, as we just mentioned. There are other trace elements in these streams that are also released. It's clear that other trace elements are released in elevated concentrations from the Appalachian mine spoils. We know that because due to laboratory experiments as well as field data, and we get some similar effects, at least in the algae and biofilm realm. Here we see In the lower left, we see selenium, and we see mining in 3 columns of dots for mining influence on the left, and 3 columns of dots for mining for reference streams on the right. The 3 columns of dots are biofilm, leaf detritus, which gets covered by microbial slime, and the microbial life that covers the leaves also takes in that absorbs the selenium, and then sediments, right? The organic components of sediments. And we can see that in the mining, we call this particulate media. It says selenium in the particulate media of the mining influence streams are elevated relative to the reference streams. And lo and behold, when we look at moving to the right, we look at the same thing for the cadmium, nickel, copper, and zinc. We see the same factor that these elements are elevated in the particulate media in the mining influence streams, and therefore entering the trophic structure, entering the food chain at elevated levels in the mining influence streams. And I think we're all aware that cadmium, nickel, copper, and zinc have, serious ecotoxicological concerns. Now, whether or not these elements are actually influencing the aquatic ecosystem structure, the biotic structure, that's still a topic being investigated. But again, these are some of the issues with the water quality in the mining influence streams. Okay, recovery. There's really not much to say except that we expect that these streams will recover with time. The concentrations of salinity and trace elements we expect to decline with time. We say that based on laboratory studies, as you see in this graphic here, basically put the mine spoil in a column in the laboratory, run water through it repeatedly. The concentration of the pollutants, of the major ion pollutants coming out of the laboratory column declines with time, although it definitely remains elevated above what we would see in the reference streams, no question about that. And I'm showing here only conductivity, but the trace elements show similar patterns. And we also see similar patterns in the field for the for the conductivity. Anyhow, here we see some discharge from a Virginia valley fill, part of a study that we did. And you see the valley fill was revegetated in 1999. Took about 10 years for that valley fill to reach a point where the conductivity started declining, but then it did. The reason it took 10 years is because valley fill is big, right? It's a large structure, and you've got 40 inches of rain roughly coming down every year, and you've got hundreds of feet of mine spoil that needs to be leached with that 40 inches of rain. So it takes a while to get that same pattern coming out of the valley fill as we would have as we demonstrated much more quickly coming out of the laboratory columns. But this is what we see, and we've seen this at a number of locations. But the time for mining influence stream to reach natural background geologic contaminant concentrations is really unknown, and it's clearly going to be a long time. I guess we can say that with certainty. It will happen eventually, just geochemically. It makes sense. I mean, these mine spoils are not going to produce these types of contaminants forever, but it's going to take a long time. So, in summary, Appalachian mining causes forest loss, affects water quality and aquatic biota. Methods for reestablishing forest plant communities on mine sites are available. Water quality improvements are expected with the passage of time, but the time required for full recovery is unknown. And I thank you for your time and attention, and I hope my presentation was of interest to you.
Thank you, Carl. There are a couple of comments or questions in the chat box. One is from Kevin and Carrie, our friends from the Roanoke chapter. Welcome to you. They want to know if most legacy mines are privately owned or government owned.
Oh, they're virtually all, in Appalachia, they're virtually all privately owned. They're under private ownership. In the Western United States, there's a lot of mining on government land, but in Appalachia, I say at least 99%, if not higher, they're privately owned.
Thank you. Bruce, do you want to talk about your comment question? Are you there, Bruce?
If I can figure out how to unmute, I will.
We hear you. We hear you.
Yeah, I just figured it out.
Okay, good.
Well, I was wondering, all of the restoration that was discussed in the presentation was reforestation. I know that most of the region was forested prior to mining, but now a lot of it has been reformed. The terrains are altered quite a bit. Wouldn't some native grasslands be at least as appropriate in some of those more level areas as reforestation?
Well, there's some folks that are looking at that, looking at the native grasslands, and yeah, I've not participated in that research, but I know some people who have. But again, one of the problems with the native grasslands is the need to maintain them. Once you establish them, they're going to require constant maintenance in order to maintain that condition, you might say, that's favorable for the types of species that would do well in the native grasslands. That's not to say it couldn't be done, but it just would require constant maintenance and management and expense.
Yes, fire maintenance in many cases is typical.
Yeah, again, that's not my area. So, but I know some folks that are doing that.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that has a question that they did not put in the chat box? You were very thorough, Dr. Zipper. That was very interesting. I learned a lot.
Okay, well, thank you. But it's a significant story for those who care about the environment, and it's not often told. So I'm happy to have the opportunity to tell you. And okay, thank you.
Thank you.